Ethan Barnes, a single father and former structural safety engineer, now works as a maintenance supervisor while quietly caring every day for his elderly neighbor, Nancy Bennett, with help from his 9-year-old daughter, Grace. When Nancy's granddaughter Bennett Aerotech CEO Claire Bennett, the executive who signed Ethan's termination 10 months earlier, unexpectedly meets him at Nancy's home, she gradually realizes the kind, dependable man before her does not match the employee she believed had mishandled confidential data. Investigating further, Claire uncovers hidden emails proving COO Gary Holt ordered dangerous reductions in aircraft wing spar safety margins, then framed Ethan with a fabricated data breach after Ethan reported the defect. With evidence from Ethan's original safety report and Donna Reyes, who preserved the incriminating emails, Claire exposes Gary before the board has him removed, launches a full safety audit, and publicly admits her own mistake in firing Ethan without questioning the evidence. Ethan is offered reinstatement with back pay and accepts only after securing independent reviews for all future safety concerns to protect whistleblowers. As trust slowly replaces resentment, Claire, Ethan, Grace, and Nancy become a close family while Ethan returns as Director of Structural Safety, proving that integrity, accountability, and quiet kindness can restore both justice and hope. Ethan Barnes knocked on the pale blue door for the 400th time. A paper bag of prescriptions in one hand, a warm loaf of bread in the other. 6:15, same as always. He heard footsteps he didn't recognize, quick and precise, nothing like Nancy's shuffle. The door opened. Claire Bennett stood in the frame in a charcoal suit phone still pressed to her ear, the words dying in her throat. The woman who had signed his termination letter 10 months ago stared at the man she never expected to see again, not in a boardroom but on her own grandmother's porch. Neither of them moved. Before you keep going, guess who opens that door tomorrow morning? Some answers you won't see coming. 6 weeks earlier, Fairport, Ohio still smelled like late summer. Ethan Barnes managed the maintenance office at Briarwood Apartments, a squat brick building 3 streets over from Maple. He fixed leaking faucets, patched drywall, replaced the flickering bulb in stairwell C twice a month because the wiring was older than he was. It was not the life anyone would have guessed for him, not from the way he carried himself, not from the way he spoke. Careful, precise, like a man used to being listened to. Nobody at Briarwood asked. He never offered. His daughter Grace was 9, missing her 2 front teeth's replacements, always sketching something in the margins of her homework. Every morning he walked her the 6 blocks to Fairport Elementary, and every morning on the way back he stopped at the house with the pale blue door. It had started with a soccer ball. Grace had kicked it too hard in the side yard, and it had rolled straight into Nancy Bennett's rose bed, flattening 3 stems. Nancy had come out onto her porch, 76 years old and steady on her feet, and instead of scolding the girl, she'd laughed until she had to sit down. Ethan had come to apologize and ended up staying for coffee. That was 6 months ago. I hadn't missed a morning since. Nancy lived alone. Her husband had been gone 11 years. Her son and his wife had moved to Arizona for the winters and never quite moved back. She managed fine, she always said, waving off help before asking for it in some sideways fashion. A jar lid. She couldn't twist a porch light that needed changing a prescription she'd rather not drive for anymore. Ethan never made her ask twice. "You spoil me," she told him one morning, watching him replace the batteries in her smoke detector. "You feed my kid banana bread every week," Ethan said. "I think we're square." The town itself made the arrangement easy. Fairport was small enough that everybody's routines eventually crossed the same grocery store, the same 2-lane roads, the same diner on Route 9 where half the town seemed to eat breakfast on Saturdays. Ethan had grown up 30 miles east of here, and had chosen Fairport on purpose after everything because nobody in it knew what he used to be. Grace liked Nancy's kitchen best of all the kitchens. She knew better even than her own because it always smelled like something baking, and because Nancy let her lick the bowl without asking if she'd washed her hands first. On Saturdays, the 3 of them sat at the chipped formica table, and Nancy told stories about a life Ethan only half listened to, a company her family had built. A granddaughter who ran it now, too busy, too far, too much like her father had been. "She calls every Sunday," Nancy said once, stirring sugar into her tea. 10 minutes tops. Girl works harder than anybody I ever knew, and for what I keep telling her, come see the house. I'm not getting younger." Ethan nodded along the way. "You nod at a story that isn't really about you." He knew nothing about corporate ladders anymore, wanted to know less. Whatever office his own past belonged to, he'd shut the door on it the day security walked him out of a building with his name still on the parking spot. He never brought it up, not to Nancy, not to Grace, not to anyone in Fairport. As far as this town was concerned, Ethan Barnes had always fixed leaky faucets for a living, and that was fine by him. Some nights after Grace was asleep, Ethan sorted through the boxes still stacked in the hall closet, remnants of the move from the old house that he hadn't gotten around to unpacking in over a year. Tape spare fuses, a drawer's worth of things that belonged to no particular category. He was digging for packing tape one night when his hand caught the edge of something stiff and plastic wedged beneath a folder of old insurance papers. He pulled it out without thinking, a laminated badge. His own face looked back at him, younger, clean-shaven, a company logo stamped in the corner, Bennett Aerotech underneath in small block letters, Senior Structural Safety Engineer. He sat very still on the floor of the hallway, the badge warm from his own grip. It came back the way these things always did, not gradually, but all at once. 11 years at Bennett Aerotech. The last 3 of them running structural safety review on the composite wing spar line, the night he'd found the fatigue stress numbers that didn't add up. Numbers that meant a batch of load-bearing components had been cleared for shipment without meeting spec. The report he'd filed the meeting where his supervisor's face had gone very still and very careful. The weeks after, when internal documents he had never touched turned up flagged under his login the termination letter with a signature at the bottom that had meant nothing to him, then just a name, Claire Bennett, printed neat above a title. He remembered standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box of desk photos watching people he'd worked with for a decade suddenly find their phones very interesting. He remembered telling himself he would fight it, and then remembered the retainer for an employment lawyer and Grace's tuition and the mortgage, and how fighting a company with lawyers on staff was a luxury built for people who still had savings. He remembered, too, the specific silence of that last week, the way conversation stopped when he walked into a break room, the way a woman he'd mentored for 2 years suddenly couldn't meet his eyes in the hallway. Nobody had asked him for his side of it. Nobody apparently had needed to. A signature on a termination letter had done all the talking that was required, and everyone downstream of that signature had simply believed what they were told to believe. He'd taken the maintenance job at Briarwood 8 months later after the unemployment checks ran dry and the interviews for engineering roles kept circling back to the same question times. Can you explain the gap and the reason for departure? Times a question with no good answer that didn't sound like an excuse. Fixing faucets paid less than 1/3 of what he used to make. It also came with no questions attached, and some days that felt like the better trade. He hadn't told anyone in Fairport any of it. What was there to tell? He'd been a promising man with a good title, and then he'd been nothing. And somewhere in between, he had learned that titles were the easiest thing in the world to take from you. Ethan turned the badge over once in his hand, feeling the sharp corners bite into his palm, and then he dropped it into the kitchen trash under the coffee grounds where it wouldn't catch Grace's eye if she went looking for anything in the morning. He didn't sleep much that night, but when 6:00 came, he made coffee packed. Grace's lunch walked her to school and turned toward Maple Street exactly the way he always did, a bag of bread swinging from his hand because whatever that badge had once meant, it had nothing to do with the woman waiting for her groceries 3 blocks from here. Some mornings start like every other morning. This one wouldn't stay that way. Claire Bennett had not planned on being in Fairport that morning. A board meeting had collapsed at the last minute, Gary Holt, her COO, citing a scheduling conflict that felt thinner than he probably intended. And rather than sit in her office rereading the same quarterly deck she'd gotten in the car and driven the 40 minutes to her grandmother's house the way she kept promising herself she'd do more often and never quite managed, she hadn't called ahead. Nancy never minded surprises. She let herself in with her spare key, calling out as she crossed the hall and was halfway to the kitchen when the knock came at the front door, soft familiar time to the second, like it always was, though Claire had no way of knowing that. She turned back and opened it without thinking. Phone still pressed to her ear mid-sentence to Donna about a contract clause that suddenly stopped mattering. The man on the porch went rigid. She went rigid a half-second after him. Ethan Barnes. Bread in one hand, a small paper bag of medication in the other, standing on her grandmother's welcome mat, like he belonged there, because as it turned out, he did. Claire Nancy's voice came from the kitchen, delighted. "Is that Ethan? Oh, you two are finally meeting properly." Neither of them answered right away. Ethan's eyes found Claire's and held them, a silent question passing between them faster than either could have explained it. How much does she know? How much do I say, not here, not like this? Nancy appeared in the hallway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, beaming at both of them like she'd engineered the moment herself. Ethan, this is my granddaughter Claire, the one I'm always talking your ear off about. Claire, this is the young man who's been keeping me company every morning for months. I don't know what I'd do without him. Claire started and stopped. We've run into each other, Ethan said, even unhurried, the same voice he used to talk Grace down from a tantrum. Small town, paths cross. Claire's eyes flicked to him again, something unreadable moving behind them, and then she found her footing. Right. A few times, actually. The lie came out smoother than she expected, though her pulse hadn't slowed at all. Nancy looked between them, satisfied, entirely unaware that she was standing at the center of something neither of them had words for yet. Well, good. I've been wanting you two to meet properly for ages. She turned back toward the kitchen. Ethan, you're staying for dinner, both of you. I made too much chicken and I refused to eat it alone for the third night this week. It wasn't a question. It never was with Nancy. She was already moving back toward the stove, entirely certain the matter was settled, humming something under her breath that neither of them recognized. Claire watched her grandmother go, then glanced at Ethan, who gave the smallest shrug, the kind that said, "Times you know how this goes better than I do." It struck her, standing there in this front hall with her heels still on and her phone finally silent in her pocket. How easily this house made decisions for people. Nobody in this kitchen had ever asked her permission for anything, and somehow that had never once bothered her the way it should have. Claire opened her mouth to decline. She had 4 hours of work waiting for her back at the office, a call with the safety compliance team, a dozen reasons to leave, and found none of them came out. Sure, she said instead, watching Ethan set the bread down on the counter like he'd done it 100 times because he had. I'd like that. Ethan didn't look at her again until Nancy had turned her back, and when he did, it wasn't anger in his face. It was something more careful than that, a man recalculating in real time exactly how much ground he was standing on. Dinner ran 2 hours longer than Claire had planned for, and every minute of it felt like walking across ice she couldn't be sure would hold. Nancy did most of the talking, the way she always did. Stories about Ethan fixing the porch step, about Grace's drawings taped to the refrigerator, about a church bake sale where Ethan's banana bread had outsold 3 other tables combined. Claire laughed in the right places and asked the right questions, and felt the entire time like she was performing a version of herself built specifically for this kitchen. So what is it you do exactly? Grace asked at one point, legs swinging under her chair entirely without malice. Grandma Nancy says you work at an office. I do, Claire said, and felt Ethan's eyes on her without looking up. Boring stuff, paperwork mostly. It wasn't a lie so much as it was everything true left unsaid. Ethan steered the conversation elsewhere with the practiced ease of a man raising a 9-year-old alone, a joke about Grace's homework and a question for Nancy about her garden, and Claire found herself grateful for it in a way she didn't examine too closely. She drove home that night with both hands tight on the wheel, replaying every second of it. By the time she reached her apartment, she had already pulled up the employee archive on her laptop, fingers hovering over the search bar for a long moment before she typed the name Barnes Ethan, terminated September. The file was thinner than she remembered signing off on. She read it twice. Data mishandling, unauthorized access to restricted files, termination for cause. Her own signature sat at the bottom of the recommendation. Dated 10 months back, a decision she had made in an 11-minute meeting with Gary Holt, standing at her shoulder, certain and urgent, the kind of certain that hadn't left room for questions. She closed the laptop without reading further. It wasn't enough to build a conclusion on not yet, and she told herself that was the only reason her stomach felt the way it did. She didn't mention any of it to Gary. Something about the file, thin as it was, made her want to look a while longer before she let anyone else see her looking. 3 streets from Nancy's house, Ethan was fielding a different kind of pressure. Roger Denning, who owned the Briarwood building, had heard from someone at the diner that Ethan Barnes had been seen having dinner with the Bennett family. The Bennett family, as in Bennett Aerotech, as in the company whose name was on half the buildings downtown. Anything I should know about Denning asked the next morning, arms crossed in the doorway of the maintenance office. Not quite accusing, not quite not. No, Ethan said, just neighbors. Denning let it go, but Ethan noticed for the rest of the week that his boss watched him a little longer than usual whenever he passed. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning, and yet Ethan found himself replaying it anyway. The old instinct kicking in, the one that had learned the hard way exactly how fast a good reputation could turn on a rumor nobody bothered to check. At home that night, he sat at the kitchen table long after Grace had gone to bed, turning a cold cup of coffee in slow circles, thinking about a dinner table 3 streets over and a woman he still didn't know how to feel about. He didn't reach any conclusions. He rarely did these days when it came to anything connected to that name. Back at Bennett Aerotech, Donna Reyes noticed something to her boss still at her desk well past 7 Hosro, a personnel file open on her second monitor that Donna recognized without needing to ask why. Donna didn't say anything. She had her own reasons for staying quiet about that name, reasons that had kept her up more nights than she'd admit to anyone. And for now, watching Claire read, she decided the timing still wasn't right to change that. Claire started finding reasons to drive to Fairport. She told herself it was overdue. Nancy deserved more than 10-minute Sunday calls, and that much was true. But she couldn't pretend, not fully, that some part of the drive wasn't shaped around the hour. Ethan usually came by the low light of early evening when he'd stop in after his shift to check the porch railing or bring over a covered dish Grace had helped make. She watched him more than she meant to. The way he crouched to Grace's eye level instead of talking down at her, the way he rehung Nancy's storm door without being asked, checking the hinges twice before he called it finished. None of it matched the 2 words sitting in his personnel file times for cause times. And the mismatch sat uneasily in her chest every time she saw him. She started noticing smaller things, too. The way he never let Nancy carry anything heavier than a teacup. The way he'd quietly fixed the wobble in the porch step without being asked twice. And the patience in his voice when Grace got stuck on long division and he walked her through it 3 different ways until one of them clicked. None of it read like a man who'd been careless with confidential data. It read like a man who paid attention to things other people missed, which was, she realized with a slow discomfort, exactly the kind of person you'd want reviewing structural safety reports. One evening, clearing plates together while Nancy dozed in her recliner and Grace colored at the table. Claire found herself standing close enough to Ethan that she had to lower her voice to keep the question private. "Do you hate me?" she asked, not looking at him. Hand still in the dishwasher. He didn't pretend not to understand. "I don't have room left for that," he said. "Not with a 9-year-old to raise." It wasn't forgiveness. It landed harder than an accusation would have. "That's not an answer," Claire said. "It's the only one I've got right now." He dried a plate, set it down, met her eyes for the first time all evening. "You want a different one. You're going to have to earn it." She thought about that sentence the whole drive home, turning it over. The way she turned over structural reports looking for the load-bearing piece. The one line that would tell her whether the whole thing could still hold weight or whether it had already failed somewhere she couldn't see yet. By the time she reached the office parking lot, she had made a decision. She found Donna at her desk the next morning before either of them had taken their coats off. "I need everything on the Barnes termination," Claire said. "Every email, every draft of that report, anything that touched Gary Holt's inbox in the 2 weeks before it happened. Don't route it through legal, just bring it to me." Donna's hand went still on her keyboard for half a second too long. Everything Claire repeated, and something in her voice made clear this wasn't a request she intended to have questioned. "Understood," Donna said, and turned back to her screen, though it took her a long moment before she could make herself start typing. Donna Reyes had told herself for 10 months that silence was the responsible choice. She had 2 kids at home and a mortgage that didn't care about her conscience, and Gary Holt had made it very clear in the careful, deniable way powerful men make things clear that certain emails were better left unmentioned. She'd kept a copy anyway. She told herself it was for her own protection in case anyone ever asked the right questions. Nobody ever had until now. She found Claire in her office after 600, the building mostly emptied out, and set a folder on the desk without a word. "What is this?" "Everything you asked for," Donna said. "And one thing you didn't." Claire opened the folder. On top sat a printed email chain dated 14 months back, 4 months before Ethan's termination. Gary Holt to 2 junior engineers. Subject line stripped of anything incriminating. Body text anything but. Instructions to trim material tolerance margins on the wing spar composite batch by 11% to hit quarterly cost targets, and a note near the bottom flagging that the safety review office, Ethan's office, would need to be in Gary's words managed. 2 pages later, a second thread. Ethan's original report, the one that had gotten him fired, flagging the exact tolerance failure Gary had ordered, and beneath it an internal message from Gary to HR drafted the same week laying groundwork for a data mishandling complaint against the safety engineer who was, quote, becoming a liability to the timeline. Claire read it 3 times before she trusted herself to speak. He never leaked anything, she said quietly. He found what Gary was hiding. I should have said something sooner, Donna said, voice shaking now that it was out. I was scared. I've still got 2 kids and 1 income, and I know exactly what happens to people who cross Gary Holt. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. Claire looked up at her, and whatever fury had been building in her chest for the last 10 minutes, none of it landed on Donna. You just did the hard part, she said. That's not nothing. Donna nodded, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for over a year. Claire sat with the folder long after Donna left the office dark, except for her desk lamp. The full shape of what she'd done finally visible to her for the first time. Not a mistake, not an oversight, but a man's entire career taken apart on purpose with her signature at the bottom of the paperwork. She thought about Ethan crouched at Grace's eye level. She thought about the porch railing, the storm door hinges checked twice. She thought about times you're going to have to earn it, and understood sitting alone in her office at 9:00 at night that an apology delivered here across a desk with lawyers eventually in the room would mean nothing at all compared to one delivered honestly face to face to the man who'd spent 10 months rebuilding a life she had helped tear down. She sat with that thought a long time, watching the lights of downtown Fairport blink on through her office window one by one, and understood that whatever came next couldn't start with a press release or a legal statement. It had to start with a conversation the kind she should have had 10 months ago before any of this became a folder on her desk instead of a person standing on her grandmother's porch. She called him before she let herself think better of it. I need to see you, she said when he picked up. Not at Nancy's, just you. There was a pause on the line long enough that she wondered if he'd hang up. Tomorrow, Ethan said finally. After Grace is at school. Gary Holt did not like being summoned to a board session with no agenda circulated in advance, and he liked it even less when he walked in and saw Claire seated at the head of the table with a folder in front of her, and Donna Reyes standing quietly by the door. What's this about? He asked, taking his seat with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that the ground beneath him might not hold. Claire didn't waste time. She laid the printed emails across the table one by one, letting each board member read them in silence before she spoke. 14 months ago, Gary ordered a reduction in structural tolerance margins on the wing spar composite line to protect quarterly numbers. Ethan Barnes flagged it exactly as his job required him to. 3 weeks later, Gary began building a termination case against him, not for the tolerance failure, but for a data breach that never happened. The room went very still. This is absurd, Gary said too fast. You're taking the word of a disgruntled ex-employee and turning it into a conspiracy. I'm taking the word of your own emails, Claire said and slid the last page across the table. Written under your name, sent from your account, time-stamped before his termination was ever discussed. Gary's composure cracked for the first time, a flush climbing up from his collar. He looked at Donna, and something in his expression made her flinch, though she held her ground. You want to talk about disgruntled? Gary said low, now aimed at Claire alone. How disgruntled is the board going to be when they hear their CEO has been having dinner with the man she fired at her own grandmother's house every week for a month? How's that going to read in the press? Claire, careful who you're trying to expose. The threat landed, and for a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then the conference room door opened. Ethan stepped in still in his work jacket, a manila folder of his own tucked under one arm. He hadn't been invited, but Claire had told him where and when, and he'd made his own decision about whether to come. I have the original structural report, Ethan said, setting it down beside Gary's emails without raising his voice. Filed the same week as the tolerance change. Every data point in it matches what your own engineers reported before someone told them to stop asking questions. Gary's mouth opened and nothing came out. You built a case against the one man who did his job, Claire said, standing now, addressing the room rather than Gary alone. I signed off on it without asking enough questions, and I own that, but the record is in front of you. I'd like the board to vote on Gary Holt's immediate suspension pending a full internal and external safety review. The vote, when it came, was not close. Gary was escorted from the building within the hour, his access revoked before he reached the parking lot. His protests trailing behind him down a hallway. Nobody stopped to watch. Ethan stood by the window afterward, watching the afternoon light fall across a company that had once been the center of his whole life, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 10 months. Not triumph exactly, but the quiet relief of finally being believed. Claire crossed the room and stood beside him close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Thank you, she said, for coming. I didn't do it for you, Ethan said, though there was no edge in it now. I did it because it was true. I know, Claire said. That's exactly why it mattered. The internal investigation moved fast once it started. Within a week, Gary Holt's suspension became a formal termination. The Safety Review Board opened a full audit of every wing spar batch shipped in the last 18 months, and 2 separate engineering firms were brought in to verify Ethan's original findings, both confirming what he'd flagged over a year earlier, down to the decimal. Claire called a full staff meeting on a Thursday morning. The auditorium at Bennett Aerotech filled past capacity for the first time anyone could remember. She didn't read from notes. 10 months ago, this company fired a man for telling the truth. She said, her voice steady, though her hands weren't. Ethan Barnes found a safety failure that could have put lives at risk, reported it exactly as he was trained to, and was punished for it by someone protecting his own numbers instead of our people. I signed that termination. I own that mistake publicly in front of all of you. She looked out at the room, then found Ethan standing near the back arms, crossed Grace's drawing, the one of their kitchen table, the one he still didn't know Claire had seen taped to Nancy's fridge, folded in his jacket pocket, though nobody in that room knew that detail but him. I'm offering Mr. Barnes his position back at a senior level, reflecting the 10 months this company owes him, along with full back pay and a formal correction to his record. But more than that, I'm asking the board to make what he did policy. Every safety flag gets independent review before termination is even considered. We don't bury the people who tell us the truth, not again. The applause that followed was not performative. It came from people who had worked alongside Ethan for a decade and never understood why he disappeared from engineers who'd quietly wondered if raising a safety flag of their own would cost them the same way it had cost him. For the first time in 10 months, the answer to that question had changed in front of all of them. Someone near the front started clapping before Claire had even finished speaking, and by the time she stepped back from the podium, most of the room was on its feet. Ethan hadn't expected that part. He stood very still through it, jaw tight, and didn't trust himself to say anything until the sound had died down. Afterward, in the quiet of the emptying hallway, Ethan found Claire near the elevators. I'm not saying yes today, he said. I need time. 10 months doesn't undo itself because of one good meeting. I know, Claire said. Take whatever time you need. He nodded, and for a moment neither of them moved toward the door. Somewhere behind them, the parking lot lights were flickering on one by one as the afternoon slid toward evening, and neither of them seemed in any hurry to be the first to walk toward their car. That evening, they drove to Maple Street separately and arrived within minutes of each other. Standing on the porch under the same light where this had all started, neither one performing anything anymore. I think it's time we told her the truth, Claire said quietly, hand resting on the doorframe. All of it. Ethan looked at the pale blue door, then at her. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. He knocked once out of habit, though the door was already open. Nancy listened to the whole story without interrupting, which for Nancy was its own kind of miracle. She heard about the report, the termination, the 10 months of silence, the dinner that had started as an accident and turned into a performance. Neither of them had planned on giving. She heard about the folder Donna had brought the board meeting the vote. When they finished, she sat back in her recliner and was quiet long enough that Claire started to worry. Then Nancy laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her one hand pressed to her chest. So this whole time, she said, you two have been sitting at my table lying to an old woman's face about how you met. Not lying exactly? Claire started. Lying, Nancy said, delighted rather than offended. Bless you both. I've been telling everyone at church what a lovely coincidence it was my granddaughter and the nice young man from down the street. She shook her head, still smiling. Well, I suppose it still is a lovely coincidence, just a different kind than I thought. In the weeks that followed, the evenings at Nancy's house stopped needing a script. Claire showed up without warning texts, without excuses, simply because she wanted to. Ethan stopped watching his words so carefully around her. What was left, once the pretending fell away, was something neither of them had expected to find on a stranger's porch in Fairport, Ohio. Two people who'd both been knocked down by the same mistake, slowly learning to trust the ground again. Some evenings they didn't talk about the company at all. Claire helped Grace with a science project on bridge trusses, laughing when she realized halfway through that she was explaining load distribution to a 9-year-old the same way she used to explain it to junior engineers. Ethan taught Nancy how to video call her son in Arizona without hanging up on him by accident. A small triumph, Nancy announced to the whole table like she'd cracked a code. Nobody was performing anything for anybody. It was, Claire thought more than once, the most ordinary kind of happiness she'd had in years, and she hadn't realized how much she'd been missing it until it was sitting across the table from her. Grace, who had never needed the whole story to know a good thing when she saw one, drew a new picture one evening at the kitchen table and taped it to Nancy's refrigerator without asking anyone's permission. 4 figures around a table: Ethan, Grace, Nancy, and new to the drawing, Claire. Her stick figure hand linked with Ethan's. Nancy noticed it first and said nothing, just smiled into her tea. Claire noticed it second, and her throat went tight in a way she hadn't expected over a crayon drawing. It was Ethan who noticed last, drying his hands on a dish towel, and when he saw it, he didn't say anything either. He crossed the kitchen, reached for Claire's hand where it rested on the counter, and simply held it. No declaration, no explanation, nothing that needed saying out loud after everything they'd already survived to get here. Claire looked down at their hands together, then up at him, and something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for 10 months and longer. Okay, Ethan asked quietly. Okay, Claire said. Ethan started back at Bennett Aerospace on a Monday in late October, 3 weeks after the board vote, in a newly created role director of structural safety reporting directly to the CEO. He negotiated one condition into the offer that Claire hadn't expected and immediately agreed to. Every safety concern flagged by any engineer at any level would be reviewed by an independent panel before it ever reached a termination discussion. Gary Holt's name became a case study in the new employee handbook, an example of exactly what the company would no longer tolerate. On his first morning, Ethan still stopped at the pale blue door on Maple Street the way he had every morning for months, bread in one hand, a small bag from the pharmacy in the other. This time, when he knocked, Claire opened the door. She was already dressed for the office, hair pulled back a second, travel mug of coffee waiting on the counter behind her, made exactly the way she'd learned he took it. Morning, she said, stepping aside to let him in. Morning, he said, and neither of them needed to perform anything for the woman waiting at the kitchen table anymore. They ate breakfast together that day, the way they had a dozen times before, Nancy presiding over the table with her usual commentary. Grace narrating a dream she'd had about a talking dog, sunlight coming in slow and gold through the kitchen window. But something had shifted quiet and permanent in the space between Ethan's chair and Claire's. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. Nancy caught Claire's eye across the table at one point and said nothing, just smiled into her coffee, the particular smile of a woman who suspected she'd had a hand in something good and didn't need credit for it. Grace's drawing was still taped to the refrigerator behind her, a little curled at one corner now. 4 stick figures around a table that had somehow, without anyone deciding it on purpose, become true. Later walking. Grace to school. Ethan felt his phone buzz, a text from Claire. 3 words, nothing more. See you tonight. He smiled at his phone the way a man does when he isn't trying to hide it anymore, and Grace, walking beside him with her backpack bouncing, glanced up and grinned like she already understood something. He was only just letting himself believe. You're doing the smile again, she said. What smile? The one you didn't used to do? She said it simply, the way kids say the truest things without any weight attached to them at all, and kept walking like she hadn't just seen straight through him. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He put the phone back in his pocket and matched his stride to hers, and for the first time in almost a year, the walk to school felt like exactly what it was, an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, with nothing left to hide from anyone. They had not gone looking for any of this. Not the wing spar reports, not the board vote, not the quiet mornings that turned into something neither of them had a name for yet. They had only ever been looking out for a lonely old woman on Maple Street showing up for her one ordinary morning at a time. Neither of them had been looking for this. They had only been looking out for someone else.